Write in the comments which country you're watching from and which sultan fascinates you the most. If you're interested in the hidden stories of the Ottoman Empire, subscribe to the channel. August 29th, 1526. A vast, rain-soaked plain in Hungary. An entire kingdom, embodied by its knights in shining armor, stands ready for a glorious charge. They face the largest army Europe has ever seen, led by a sultan at the zenith of his power, Suleiman the Magnificent. What followed was not a battle, but an annihilation. A 500-year-old kingdom was extinguished in less than 2 hours. This is the story of how ambition, technology, and one fateful decision erased a nation from the map. In the year 1520, a shadow passed over the Ottoman Empire. Sultan Selim I, known to his people as Yavuz, the stern, the grim, was dead. He was a tempest of a man, a conqueror who had, in just 8 years, doubled the size of the empire. He had crushed the Safavid Shah at Chaldiran, annihilated the Mamluk Sultanate, and brought Egypt, Syria, and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina under Ottoman rule. His treasury overflowed with the wealth of conquered nations, and his methods were as sharp and merciless as a janissary's yataghan. He had waded through the blood of his own brothers and nephews to secure his throne, a grim necessity in a world where power was absolute and mercy a fatal weakness. When news of his death reached the courts of Europe, there was a collective, palpable sigh of relief. His successor, his only son, was a young man of 26 named Suleiman. The reports from Venetian bailiffs and foreign envoys described him as a quiet, scholarly figure, more interested in poetry and goldsmithing than in the brutal art of war. They saw a lamb succeeding a lion. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Suleiman was not his father, it was true. Where Selim was a storm, Suleiman was the calm, deep ocean, his ambitions running far deeper and stronger. He did not merely inherit his father's empire, he inherited a challenge. Selim had secured the East, neutralizing the empire's ancient rivals and filling its coffers. He had left his son a perfected instrument of war and a clear, unspoken directive: turn west. The shadow of Selim was not a burden to be escaped, but a foundation upon which to build a legacy that would dwarf all others. Suleiman would not be the grim. He would be the lawgiver, Kanuni. He would be the magnificent, and his magnificence would be paid for with the fire and steel he would unleash upon the heart of Christendom. While a new sun rose over the Bosphorus, a long, tragic twilight was settling over the Kingdom of Hungary. On its throne sat Louis II, a monarch in name, but a boy in reality. He had been crowned as a child, a pawn in the vicious games of his own powerful nobles. Now, a young man, he possessed the titles of King of Hungary, Croatia, and Bohemia, but he commanded little true authority. The Hungary he inherited was a fractured, decaying realm, a ghost of the great power it had been under the legendary Matthias Corvinus. The kingdom was not a unified state, but a loose confederation of arrogant, semi-independent magnates. These great lords, ruling vast estates from their fortified castles, commanded larger private armies than the king himself. They defied his decrees, refused his taxes, and cared more for their own rivalries than for the defense of the nation. The royal treasury was perpetually empty, plundered to fund their lavish lifestyles. While the greatest military power on earth gathered on their southern border, the Hungarian nobles bickered over land rights and privileges. Louis, intelligent and well-meaning, was trapped in a gilded cage of powerlessness. He sent desperate pleas for unity, for funds to repair the crumbling border fortresses like Belgrade, but his voice was lost in the cacophony of aristocratic greed. The kingdom was rotting from the inside out. Peasant revolts had been brutally suppressed years earlier, leaving a legacy of bitterness and mistrust that severed the common man from the fate of the nobility. Religious turmoil, the precursor to the Protestant Reformation, was beginning to tear at the spiritual unity of the land. Louis II sat on a broken throne, ruling a kingdom already defeated by its own internal demons. He was a shepherd without a flock, a general without an army, and a king without a kingdom. And from the east the wolf was watching, smelling the scent of decay on the wind. In the heart of the Topkapi Palace, away from the formal rigidities of the divan, the true course of the Ottoman Empire was being set. It was set not by a council of viziers, but in the quiet conversations between two men who were more than master and servant. They were soulmates. One was Sultan Suleiman. The other was a man named Ibrahim, Pargalu Ibrahim, the man from Parga, a Greek fisherman's son taken as a slave in his youth. By a stroke of fate, he had entered the palace school and became the companion of the young Prince Suleiman. They grew up together, sharing meals, studying texts, and dreaming of the future. Ibrahim's intelligence was as sharp as his loyalty was absolute. When Suleiman ascended the throne, he elevated his friend with breathtaking speed, first to Master of the Pages, then to Grand Vizier, the second most powerful man in the world. Ibrahim was Suleiman's shadow, his confidant, his strategist. He was the only man who could dine with the Sultan, the only one who could speak to him with the frankness of a brother. And it was Ibrahim's whisper that gave form to Suleiman's immense, yet undefined ambition. While others saw the need for consolidation, Ibrahim saw the path to universal dominion. He spoke to Suleiman not of his father's conquests in the East, but of the legends of the West, of Alexander the Great, who had marched from Macedon to India. He unrolled maps of Europe, pointing out the fractures, the rivalries between the Habsburgs and the French, the internal weakness of Hungary. He saw Christendom not as a monolith, but as a crumbling edifice ready to be pushed. Hungary, he argued, was the key. It was the gateway to Vienna, and Vienna was the gateway to the heart of Europe. Ibrahim's vision was a grand synthesis of Turkic, Persian, and Roman imperial traditions, all culminating in Suleiman as the Padishah of a world empire. He was the architect of the dream, and Suleiman was its destined executor. The march west was not just a policy. It became a sacred, shared obsession. The year is 1521. The whispers in the palace have become the roar of an army on the march. Suleiman's first great test, his first move in the grand chess game for Europe, was aimed at a single, critical point on the map, the fortress of Belgrade. To the Hungarians, it was Nándorfehérvár, the bastion that had miraculously repelled the great Mehmed the Conqueror himself 75 years prior. To all of Christendom, it was the gate of Europe, the seemingly impregnable bulwark that had held back the Ottoman tide for generations. Its fall was unthinkable. For Suleiman, taking it was a necessity. It was a personal challenge, a chance to succeed where his revered ancestor had failed. But more than that, it was a brutal strategic calculation. With Belgrade in his hands, the entire Hungarian plain would be defenseless, the Danube would become an Ottoman highway, and the road to Buda and then to Vienna would lie open. The campaign was a masterpiece of Ottoman logistics and engineering. A massive army, spearheaded by the elite Janissaries, marched north. A fleet of ships sailed up the Danube, carrying the true key to the city, the colossal siege cannons, weapons of terrifying power. The siege began in the searing heat of summer. For weeks the Ottoman guns pounded the ancient walls, reducing stone to dust. Miners, braving death in the dark, dug tunnels to lay explosives beneath the ramparts. The small garrison of Serbs and Hungarians fought with desperate courage, but they were utterly alone. King Louis's frantic calls for a relief army were ignored by his feuding nobles. The great powers of Europe, locked in their own struggles, sent only prayers. On August 29th, after a final bloody assault, the unthinkable happened. The crescent banner of the Sultan was raised over the shattered citadel of Belgrade. A shockwave of terror and disbelief reverberated across Europe. For Suleiman, it was the ultimate vindication. He had outdone the conqueror. He had proven his mettle not just to the world, but to the lingering shadow of his father. The gate had not just been opened, it had been torn from its hinges and cast aside. While Suleiman consolidated his power in the east, a new shadow was stretching across the west. This was the age of Titans, and a rival empire was rising, one whose ambition was as boundless as the Sultan's own. The House of Habsburg. At its head was Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, a monarch on whose dominion the sun, quite literally, never set. His gaze, and that of his brother Ferdinand, now fell upon the fractured Kingdom of Hungary. Hungary, the historical bastion of Christendom, was now a geopolitical pawn, trapped between the Ottoman hammer and the Habsburg anvil. The two great powers eyed each other across the Hungarian plains, seeing not a sovereign kingdom, but a prize to be won, a buffer zone to be controlled. The Habsburgs moved with cunning diplomacy where the Ottomans moved with steel. A web of royal marriages was spun to ensnare the Hungarian crown. The young King Louis II was married to Charles's sister, Maria of Habsburg. In turn, Louis's sister, Anna, was wed to Ferdinand. It was a dynastic pincer movement, designed to ensure that should the Jagiellonian line of Hungary fail, the throne would fall directly into Habsburg hands. Ferdinand, Archduke of Austria, watched the unfolding chaos in Hungary with a predator's patience. He saw the quarreling magnates, the empty treasury, the weak and indecisive king. He knew the kingdom was rotting from within. Every Ottoman victory, every border raid that chipped away at Hungarian strength, was a quiet victory for Vienna. It weakened their mutual rival and pushed Hungary further towards dependency on Habsburg protection. The kingdom was bleeding, and the vultures were circling, waiting for the final death throes. Suleiman was the immediate threat, the clear and present danger. But the Habsburgs represented a different kind of peril, a slow political absorption, a death by 1,000 diplomatic cuts. For King Louis II, there was no escape. To fight the Sultan was to risk annihilation. To ask for Habsburg aid was to invite the wolf into the sheepfold. The fragile peace, if it could even be called that, was not destined to last. Suleiman, his authority absolute and his ambition unsated, sought to formalize his dominance over Hungary. He dispatched an envoy, Behram Çavuş, to the court at Buda. The message was simple, brutal, and utterly humiliating. Pay tribute to the Sublime Porte. Acknowledge the Sultan as your overlord, or face the consequences. For the proud and reckless Hungarian magnates, this was an insult that could not be borne. They saw it not as a final chance to avert disaster, but as a challenge to their honor. In the halls of Buda, a fatal decision was made. Accounts differ in the precise details, lost to the fog of propaganda and time. Some say the envoy was merely thrown into a dungeon. Others whisper a darker tale, that the Hungarian nobles, in a fit of suicidal arrogance, had the Ottoman envoy executed. They believed this act of defiance would rally Christendom to their cause, that the Pope and the Emperor would send armies to defend the bastion of the faith. They could not have been more wrong. They had grossly misjudged their enemy. This was not some border dispute with a European prince. This was an affront to the Padishah, the shadow of God on earth. When news of his envoy's fate reached Suleiman in Constantinople, the reaction was not one of political calculation, but of cold, elemental fury. This was more than a casus belli. It was a personal insult, a stain upon the honor of the Ottoman dynasty. The response would not be another negotiation. It would be a lesson taught with fire, steel, and the utter eradication of the kingdom that had dared to defy him. The imperial decree was issued. The twos, the horsetail standards signifying the Sultan's presence in a campaign, were brought out from the palace. The war was not merely declared, it was unleashed. The message from the Hungarian court had been received, and Suleiman was about to write his reply across their lands in the blood of their king and their people. On the 23rd of April, 1526, a spectacle of terrifying magnificence began. From the gates of Constantinople, Suleiman the Magnificent marched at the head of his imperial army. This was no mere punitive expedition. It was a force of conquest, a moving city of warriors dedicated to a single purpose: the subjugation of Hungary. The numbers alone were staggering, a testament to the organizational genius of the Ottoman state. An army of perhaps 100,000 men, including the elite of the empire. At its heart were the Janissaries, the slave soldiers raised from childhood for war, marching in perfect unison, their loyalty absolute, their skill with the musket unmatched in the world. They were flanked by the vast feudal cavalry, the Sipahis, armored riders whose thundering charge could shatter enemy lines, and ahead of them all ranged the Akinci, the light cavalry raiders, the eyes and ears of the army, spreading terror deep into enemy territory. But the true heart of Ottoman power lay in its artillery. Hundreds of cannons, from light field pieces to monstrous siege guns that had shattered the walls of Rhodes, were hauled by thousands of oxen, their iron mouths promising a symphony of destruction. The logistics of this endeavor were a marvel. An army of this size required a river of food, fodder, and ammunition to flow behind it. Engineers moved ahead, building roads and bridging rivers. The most spectacular of their feats was a pontoon bridge, a masterpiece of military engineering, constructed across the treacherous Drava River, allowing the entire force to cross into the heartland of Hungary unimpeded. Suleiman himself commanded from the center, a figure of absolute authority, surrounded by his household troops and viziers. His presence electrified the army. This was a holy war, a Gaza, and the Sultan was their leader in this world and their guarantor in the next. As this human avalanche rolled north through the Balkans, it gained momentum, an unstoppable force of nature. The earth itself seemed to groan under its weight. For the people of Hungary, every report, every rumor of its relentless advance was a death knell tolling ever closer. While a unified river of steel flowed from Constantinople, the Kingdom of Hungary was a stagnant swamp of division and indecision. The nation that would face Suleiman's legions was already defeated, not by an external enemy, but by itself. At the center of this tragedy was King Louis II. He was just 20 years old, a young man burdened with a crown too heavy and a kingdom too broken to rule. He possessed neither the wealth, the authority, nor the ruthless charisma to unite his fractious nobility. His pleas for unity and funds were met with suspicion and contempt. The true power in Hungary lay with the great magnates, territorial lords who behaved like kings in their own domains. They were consumed by petty rivalries and dynastic ambitions, jealously guarding their own power against the king and each other. The most powerful of them, John Zapolya, the immensely wealthy voivode of Transylvania, commanded the largest private army in the kingdom. But he despised the king's German and Habsburg-leaning advisors and saw the crisis as an opportunity to advance his own claim to the throne. Why should he risk his magnificent army to save a king he held in contempt? As Louis desperately tried to summon the feudal levies, the response was pathetic. Messengers were ignored. Summons were delayed. Nobles bickered over who should lead, who should pay, and where they should fight. The kingdom was financially bankrupt, unable to hire the professional mercenaries that were now essential to European warfare. They would have to rely on a medieval system of peasant levies and noble retinues, a force ill-equipped and ill-disciplined to face the professional might of the Janissaries and the Ottoman artillery. In the court at Buda, paralysis reigned. Some argued for waiting for Zapolya's Transylvanian army. Others, led by the fiery Archbishop Paul Tomori, a warrior priest of immense courage, demanded an immediate confrontation, believing any delay was a sign of cowardice that would further demoralize the nation. Hungary was not a united kingdom marching to war. It was a collection of quarreling factions stumbling towards a precipice, blind to the abyss that awaited them. Within the Hungarian camp, desperation was a palpable poison. King Louis II, barely a man at 20, was paralyzed by indecision, a puppet king pulled by the strings of feuding, arrogant magnates. While Suleiman's grand army marched with singular purpose, the Hungarian leadership was a nest of vipers, rife with jealousy and mistrust. They had squandered precious weeks in bickering while the Ottoman tide rolled closer. Into this cauldron of chaos stepped the unlikely commander, Paul Tamori, Archbishop of Kalocsa. A man of God, Tamori had been a soldier in his youth, a life he had forsaken for the cloth. Now, with the fate of the kingdom hanging by a thread, he was forced to wear armor over his vestments to trade his crucifix for a sword. He saw the truth with brutal clarity. Waiting for reinforcements from the Transylvanian voivode, John Zapolya, was a fool's hope. They would not arrive in time. The noble's pride and lethargy had already sealed that fate. Tamori knew the Ottoman army was a vast, disciplined war machine. To face it in a conventional battle was suicide. His only chance, his only prayer, was a gamble of breathtaking audacity. He argued, he pleaded, he raged against the cautious counsel of others. He proposed a single, cataclysmic cavalry charge aimed directly at the heart of the Ottoman beast. The plan was as simple as it was desperate. Smash through the Ottoman center, find Suleiman himself, and cut the head off the serpent. It was a strategy born of weakness, an all-or-nothing throw of the dice. To kill the Sultan on the field would be to shatter the Ottoman army's morale and leadership in a single, glorious moment. To fail would mean utter annihilation. After days of acrimonious debate, the exhausted and terrified council finally relented. They would follow the warrior archbishop's mad plan. The decision was made. The flower of Hungarian nobility would ride into the jaws of death, hoping for a miracle. The chosen ground was the plain of Mohacs. A vast, deceptively flat expanse stretching south of the Danube, it seemed the perfect arena for the knights of Hungary to unleash their terrible power. Under the blistering sun of August 29, 1526, the Christian army deployed. Archbishop Tamori arranged his forces, some 25,000 men, into two dense lines. In the vanguard was the pride of the kingdom, thousands of heavily armored knights, a wall of steel and horseflesh, shimmering like a mirage in the heat. They were the descendants of crusaders, an irresistible force that had dominated European battlefields for centuries. Behind them, a second line of less reliable infantry and lighter cavalry waited in support. They were confident, perhaps arrogant, believing their charge could break any army on earth. They could not see what lay waiting for them. Across the plain, Suleiman and his Grand Vizier, Pargalu Ibrahim Pasha, had prepared a masterpiece of military deception. Their army, nearly 3 times the size of the Hungarian force, was not arrayed in a simple line. It was a crescent, a trap. The tips of the crescent, composed of the Anatolian army on the left and the Rumelian army on the right, were angled forward, but the center, the bait, was deliberately made to look weak. A screen of Akinji light horsemen and Azap infantry stood there, seemingly vulnerable. But behind this fragile screen, hidden from Hungarian view by a slight rise in the terrain, was the true heart of the Ottoman army. Here, Ibrahim had placed 300 cannons, chained together wheel to form an unbreakable barrier. And behind the cannons, standing in silent, disciplined ranks, were the elite of the elite. Thousands of Janissaries, armed with state-of-the-art matchlock muskets. The Hungarians saw a weak center ripe for the taking. Suleiman had laid a carpet for them, leading directly into a perfectly prepared killing ground. In the late afternoon, as shadows began to lengthen across the plain, Paul Tamori gave the signal. A wave of trumpets blared a defiant challenge and the earth began to tremble. The first line of the Hungarian army, a magnificent and terrifying tide of armored nobility, surged forward. Lances were lowered, banners snapped in the wind, and thousands of hooves pounded the ground into a thunderous drumbeat. This was the moment they lived for, the charge that had won 1,000 battles. They crashed into the Ottoman front line with the force of a tidal wave. The Ottoman Azaps and Akinjas, as commanded, offered a brief token resistance before breaking and fleeing in apparent terror. A roar of triumph erupted from the Hungarian knights. Victory seemed impossibly swift, impossibly easy. They spurred their horses onward, intoxicated by the chase, hacking down the supposedly fleeing Turks. They plunged deeper and deeper into the Ottoman formation, their disciplined lines dissolving into a chaotic pursuit. They were being drawn forward, funneled precisely where Ibrahim and Suleiman wanted them. And then the world exploded. As the Hungarian cavalry crested a gentle slope in the center of the field, the trap was sprung. The ground before them erupted in a storm of fire, smoke, and iron. The 300 Ottoman cannons, hidden until this very moment, unleashed a single, coordinated volley at point-blank range. The effect was apocalyptic. Men and horses vanished in clouds of red mist. Entire ranks of knights were scythed down, their impenetrable plate armor torn to shreds by cannonballs. Before the survivors could comprehend the horror, a second cataclysm struck. From behind the cannons, the Janissaries rose as one. Thousands of muskets leveled, and a sheet of lead ripped through the now stalled and confused cavalry. The glorious charge, the ultimate weapon of medieval warfare, had been stopped dead in an instant. It had slammed into the brutal, unforgiving reality of gunpowder. The Hungarian charge was not just halted, it was broken, eviscerated. The knights, once an unstoppable force, were now a panicked, bleeding mass, trapped in a carefully constructed abattoir. The momentum that was their lifeblood was gone, replaced by shrieking confusion. As they reeled from the cannon and musket fire, the final jaws of the trap closed. The Rumelian and Anatolian cavalry, who had feigned a retreat on the flanks, now wheeled inwards with terrifying speed. They crashed into the Hungarians from both sides and the rear, completing the encirclement. The battle devolved into a slaughter. The heavily armored knights, bogged down and unable to maneuver, became helpless targets. Their lances were useless, their swords unable to reach the disciplined ranks of Janissaries who systematically shot them down. Sipahi horse archers rode in circles, pouring arrows into the chaos. The Hungarian second line, witnessing the complete destruction of the elite vanguard, broke and fled without ever properly engaging the enemy. The panic was total. King Louis II, seeing the disaster, was swept away in the rout. The retreat became a death march. The marshy ground around the Seal Stream, swollen by recent rains, became a quagmire of death. Knights weighed down by 60 pounds of steel armor fell from their horses and drowned in the mud and water, unable to stand. Archbishop Tomori, the architect of the gamble, fell fighting amidst the carnage. He was joined in death by the highest magnates of the realm. In less than 2 hours, an entire kingdom died. The army was gone. The nobility was exterminated. And King Louis, thrown by his terrified horse while trying to cross the Celle, was swallowed by the swamp, his royal corpse lost for weeks. When the silence finally fell upon the plain of Mohacs, Suleiman the Magnificent stood as the undisputed master. The medieval Kingdom of Hungary had been erased from the map, its gates to Buda and beyond thrown wide open. As the Ottoman cannons fell silent and the last screams of the Hungarian knights faded into the moans of the dying, a desperate flight was underway. King Louis II, the boy king upon whom the hopes of a nation had rested, was no longer a monarch. He was a fugitive in his own land. His magnificent armor, a symbol of his authority, now became a leaden shroud. Accompanied by a handful of loyal retainers, he spurred his terrified horse away from the field of slaughter, away from the terrifying sea of Janissary white and Sipahi crimson. The rain, which had held off during the battle, now began to fall in a cold, relentless torrent, turning the already marshy ground into a treacherous quagmire. The world dissolved into a blur of mud, mist, and fear. They galloped towards the Seal Stream, a minor waterway that was now swollen and violent from the downpour. In the chaos of the crossing, the king's exhausted horse stumbled on the steep, muddy bank. The animal lost its footing, and with a terrible cry it fell backwards, plunging the king and his gilded prison of steel into the churning water. The weight was immense, the current merciless. His attendants, themselves struggling for their lives, could only watch in horror as their sovereign, the last of the Jagiellonian kings of Hungary, was dragged beneath the surface. There was no final, heroic stand. There was no noble death in the heat of battle. There was only the cold, indifferent embrace of the swamp. Louis II of Hungary, aged just 20, drowned in a muddy creek, his body lost for weeks. It was a pathetic, ignominious end that perfectly mirrored the fate of his kingdom, a nation sinking under the weight of its own glorious past, swallowed by a tide it could no longer resist. The crown had not just fallen, it had vanished into the mire. 2 days after the battle, on August 31st, 1526, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent sat upon his golden throne, placed deliberately in the center of the conquered Hungarian camp. The field of Mohacs, still littered with the 20,000 dead, was now his imperial court. Before him, a crimson carpet was not woven of silk, but stained by the blood of the executed. This was his red throne, a symbol of absolute, terrifying victory. His Grand Vizier, Ibrahim Pasha, stood at his side, orchestrating the grim pageantry of power. The Sultan received the congratulations of his commanders, his face a mask of serene, implacable authority. He watched as the captured standards of the Hungarian nobility were laid at his feet, their vibrant colors and proud emblems now trophies of war. But the celebration was a cold, calculated affair. An order had been given. The roughly 2,000 prisoners of war, mostly knights and soldiers captured in the final rout, were brought before him. They were not to be ransomed. They were not to be enslaved. They were to be a message. In groups, they were led out and systematically beheaded, their deaths serving as the day's brutal entertainment and as a stark warning to all of Christendom. Suleiman recorded the event in his diary with chilling brevity. The emperor, seated on a golden throne, receives the homage of the viziers and beys. Massacre of 2,000 prisoners. The rain falls in torrents. This was not wanton cruelty, it was statecraft. Every head that fell was a stone in the foundation of Ottoman dominance in the region. From his bloody throne, Suleiman was not merely a conqueror, he was reshaping the map of Europe, one execution at a time. The fate of the king was still unknown, but for Suleiman it was irrelevant. The kingdom was already dead. With the Hungarian army annihilated and its king missing, the road to the capital lay open. The heart of the kingdom, the great city of Buda, was defenseless. Panic, a more effective siege engine than any cannon, had already taken the city. Nobles, merchants, and clergy fled in a great exodus, carrying what they could, leaving the city a ghost of its former glory. On September 10th, Suleiman's army arrived at the gates. There was no resistance. The Sultan entered the royal palace, the magnificent residence of Matthias Corvinus, a king renowned throughout Europe for his patronage of the arts and sciences. What followed was not a simple occupation, but a systematic dismantling of a civilization. Suleiman, a man of refined tastes, recognized the value of what he had found. He claimed the greatest treasures for himself: the magnificent bronze statues that adorned the palace, 2 enormous cannons, and, most importantly, the legendary Bibliotheca Corviniana. This library, one of the finest in the world, a treasure trove of philosophy, science, and literature, was packed into crates and shipped down the Danube to Istanbul. It was a cultural evisceration. What the Sultan did not claim, the army took. For days, the city was looted. Soldiers rampaged through the empty mansions and churches, stripping them bare. Then came the fires. The Jewish quarter was the first to burn, followed by the rest of Buda and the neighboring city of Pest. From the hills, Suleiman watched as the twin cities on the Danube were consumed by flame. The smoke, rising to the heavens, was a funeral pyre for the Hungarian Renaissance, a dark signal to the west that a new power now held the Danube, and its intentions were absolute. Suleiman did not linger. He had not come to occupy Hungary, but to break it. By late September, having plundered Buda and laid waste to the surrounding countryside, he turned his massive army south, heading back towards Istanbul, laden with treasure and over 100,000 captives destined for the slave markets. He left behind a wasteland, a political vacuum, and a kingdom in utter shock. Hungary was now a body without a head, a state without a government. The search for King Louis had finally ended in mid-October when his body was pulled from the Seal stream, identified only by the rings on his fingers. The discovery confirmed the terrible truth. The entire leadership of the nation had been wiped out in a single afternoon. Bishops, chancellors, magnates, and the king himself all lay dead on the field of Mohacs or drowned in the surrounding swamps. This decapitation of the ruling class created a power struggle of catastrophic proportions. Two figures emerged from the chaos to claim the shattered throne. One was John Zapolya, the powerful voivode of Transylvania, who had conveniently failed to arrive at Mohacs in time. He was crowned by one faction of the remaining Hungarian nobility. The other was Archduke Ferdinand of Austria, brother of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who claimed the throne through his wife, the sister of the dead King Louis. Hungary was now torn in two, one king backed by the Ottomans, the other by the Habsburgs. The Battle of Mohacs was not the end of the war, it was the beginning of a new, agonizing chapter. For the next century and a half, Hungary would be a battleground, a fractured land whose people were caught between the hammer of the Sultan and the anvil of the Emperor. The 2 hours of slaughter at Mohacs had cast a shadow that would stretch for generations. The news traveled not on the wind, but like a plague. It crept first into the border forts, whispered by shell-shocked survivors, their eyes hollowed by the things they had seen. Then it galloped with exhausted messengers on foam-flecked horses, their dispatches stained with mud and fear. From the blood-soaked plains of Mohacs, the word spread: Hungary is dead. In Vienna, the court of Ferdinand of Habsburg fell into a stunned silence. The bulwark of Christendom, the kingdom that had held the line against the Ottoman tide for over a century, had not just been breached, it had been obliterated. The dispatches spoke of an entire army, the flower of Hungarian nobility, erased from the earth in less time than it takes for the sun to set. They spoke of a king, young Louis II, last of the Jagiellons, lost in the marshy waters of a river, his heavy armor dragging him into the abyss, a pathetic, ignominious end for a sovereign. In Rome, Pope Clement VII, himself embroiled in the complex, cynical politics of Italy, felt a cold dread. This was not merely a defeat, it was a judgment. The schism of the Reformation had fractured the faith of Europe, and now God had seemingly withdrawn his favor. Who would stop the Sultan now? The great Emperor Charles V, ruler of a global empire, was in Spain, preoccupied with his wars against France. He saw the news not just as a tragedy for his sister, the widowed Queen Mary, but as a dire threat to his own dynasty and his German lands. A colossal power vacuum had opened in the very heart of Europe. With the king dead and no direct heir, the ancient crown of St. Stephen was up for grabs. But more pressing than any dynastic squabble was the terrifying immediate question that echoed in every palace and chancellery from Prague to Paris. Where was Suleiman? And what was to stop him from marching his invincible army straight to the gates of Vienna? The continent held its breath, waiting for the second blow to fall. Suleiman the Magnificent, the shadow of God on earth, did not march on Vienna. Not yet. His objective, for now, was the heart of the kingdom he had just decapitated. The Ottoman army advanced north along the Danube, a relentless river of steel and silk, unopposed. Before them lay Buda, the splendid capital of Hungary, a jewel of Renaissance architecture and learning, now utterly defenseless. The city gates were thrown open not in defiance, but in terrified supplication. Suleiman entered the royal palace of Matthias Corvinus, walking through the halls of a dynasty he had extinguished. He marveled at the legendary library, the Corvina, and the priceless treasures accumulated over centuries. He took what he wanted: bronze statues, rare manuscripts, and the throne of the king itself, and then he allowed his army to plunder the city. But he did not annex the kingdom. Annexation meant administration, consolidation, and a long, costly occupation. Suleiman was a strategist of a grander scale. He understood that a broken enemy could be more useful than a conquered province. He needed a puppet, a client king who would rule in his name and keep the Habsburgs, his true rivals, at bay. He found his man in John Zapolya, the powerful voivode of Transylvania. Zapolya, who had commanded a significant army but had conveniently failed to arrive at Mohacs in time, was elected king by a faction of the Hungarian nobility. He swore fealty to the Sultan, becoming a vassal of the Sublime Porte. This act tore the crippled nation in two. In the west, another faction of nobles, fearing Ottoman domination and citing previous treaties, elected Ferdinand of Habsburg, brother of Emperor Charles V, as their king. Suddenly, there were two kings of Hungary, each claiming legitimacy, each backed by a rival empire. Mohacs had not just destroyed an army, it had fractured a nation. The kingdom was now tripartite: Royal Hungary under the Habsburgs in the west, the Eastern Hungarian kingdom under the Ottoman vassal Zapolya, and the Central Plains, including the capital, under direct and brutal Ottoman military occupation. The stage was set not for peace but for a century and a half of relentless, grinding conflict. The division of Hungary was not a stable peace, it was a declaration of perpetual war. The two kings, Ferdinand von Habsburg and John Zapolya, could not coexist. Their rivalry was more than a personal feud. It was the local front of a global ideological struggle between the Habsburg Empire and the Ottoman Empire. Ferdinand, determined to reclaim the entirety of St. Stephen's crown, launched military campaigns to oust his rival. Zapolya, unable to match the Habsburgs' resources, turned to his overlord for aid. He sent envoys to Constantinople, bowing before the Sultan and pleading for protection. For Suleiman, this was the perfect pretext. The internal squabbles of the Hungarians provided him the ideal justification to strike directly at his ultimate enemy. His goal was no longer Buda, but Vienna, the seat of Habsburg power in Central Europe. In the spring of 1529, 3 years after Mohacs, Suleiman mobilized one of the largest armies the world had ever seen. He marched up the Danube, not merely as an ally of Zapolya, but as the master of the game. He retook Buda with ease, formally installing Zapolya on the throne before continuing his inexorable advance west. The campaign was a terrifying spectacle. The Ottoman vanguard, the feared Akinci light cavalry, spread a wide net of terror, burning villages and enslaving populations. In September, the immense Ottoman host appeared before the walls of Vienna. The city was woefully unprepared. Its garrison outnumbered more than 10 to 1. Yet, they held. A combination of torrential autumn rains that hampered the Ottoman cannons and sappers, logistical overreach, and the heroic, desperate defense of the Viennese forced Suleiman to do something he rarely did: retreat. The siege of Vienna failed, but the message was brutally clear. The buffer state was gone. The war was no longer on the distant frontier. It was at the gates of the Holy Roman Empire. Mohacs had not been the final act. It was the bloody prologue to a long, draining war that would consume generations and define the fate of empires. The battle on the plain of Mohacs lasted only 2 hours, but its shadow would stretch for centuries. For the nation of Hungary, it became the defining catastrophe of its history, the ultimate trauma etched into its collective soul. It is known as the Mohaci Ves, the perdition of Mohacs. It represents the violent death of their powerful independent medieval kingdom and the beginning of a 150-year nightmare of division, occupation, and unending warfare. The battlefield became a sacred ground of sorrow, a symbol of a golden age lost in a single afternoon of carnage and folly. Every subsequent struggle for Hungarian independence, every national poem, every defiant anthem would carry the echo of that loss. It was the wound that would never truly heal. For the Ottoman Empire, Mohacs was the apex of its power in Europe. It was Suleiman's most decisive, most spectacular field victory against a major Christian power. It shattered the Balkan frontier, secured the Danube basin, and transformed the empire from a regional threat into a direct challenger for European supremacy. The victory solidified Suleiman's reputation as a peerless military commander and a true world conqueror, the equal of Alexander or Caesar. The road to Vienna was now open, and for the next century and a half, the fate of Central Europe would be decided by the push and pull of Ottoman and Habsburg armies across the scarred Hungarian plains. For the rest of Europe, the name Mohacs became a byword for disaster, a chilling reminder of the fragility of Christendom. It forced the Habsburgs into a direct, existential conflict that would drain their treasuries and manpower for generations. The Long War between the two superpowers had begun in earnest, and Hungary was its primary, tragic battlefield. The psychological scar ran deep, creating a permanent sense of frontier anxiety, a fear of the powerful alien empire to the east. 2 hours of battle had redrawn the map, redefined empires, and left a legacy of blood and sorrow that would haunt the heart of Europe for the rest of the age.